Welcome to Conscious Pathways, the podcast where we explore the intersection of education and social justice through transformative conversations. I am your host, Brittany, and I am so happy that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time listening to Conscious Pathways, welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't always sound like this, I promise. I got a little bit of a cold, and I record my intros after the fact, so the rest of the interview will sound very, very normal. It's just the intro that sounds a little icky, and I apologize. So I will go ahead and just speed through this intro so you don't have to be exposed to how icky I sound. But today I am joined by the magnificent Casey Stockstill. Dr. Casey Stockstill is a sociologist, assistant professor at Dartmouth College, and a race scholar. Her work mostly focuses on race, class, and the micro level of social life. Right now, her research is really focused on childhood, which is why I brought her on the podcast today to talk about her new book, False Starts. It's an ethnographic account on how young children experience segregated preschools. It is such a wonderful book and such a great conversation. We talked about everything: race, class, preschools, segregation. It is a really fascinating book to read. Casey has so much knowledge and so much great information to share. So I'm so excited to share that with you. So let's hop into that interview. Hello and welcome to Conscious Pathways. I am so excited to have Casey on with me today. Welcome.
Thank you, Brittany. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on. And, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I've been reading your book, False Starts, and it has been such a wonderful book so far. I'm like 75 to 80% done with it, and I have been truly, deeply, and just really enjoying it. I do think that it's just like required reading for early childhood educators and anyone who's going into the education field to just learn this really important topic. So yes, already just fangirling over this book 2 seconds into the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so, especially from folks who are in early childhood, it really, is an honor when people read it and when they find it meaningful, because you hope you're not just kind of stating the obvious, I guess. Yeah.
That makes sense. And sometimes it is good to even state the obvious, because it might be obvious to me or it might be obvious to someone else, but to someone else it might not be completely obvious. So I do that all the time too, when I'm just like, I don't think people want to know all this information, and then I'll get feedback and they're like, no, I didn't know that. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're in an echo chamber, so you're hearing the same things. So I hear the same things about anti-bias all the time. Just, all the different tests, all the different data, like I hear it nonstop. So sometimes I forget that if you're not intermeshed in it constantly, you're not hearing about this. So I'll just like casually spout out some data and someone's like, wait, what? And I'm like, oh yeah. Let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
But speaking of early childhood, so, I always like to know, why early childhood? Why was this an interest of yours? And like, kind of, where did you get your start within early childhood?
It started for me in college when I was an undergraduate student, and I just needed money and I needed a job. I had babysat before, so I knew I liked children, but I got a job as a teacher aide at a Head Start, and would spend maybe 15 hours a week working there, being with the children. And they were 3 and 4, right? And kids are just so observant and funny and honest. Yep. And at the same time, I was taking classes in sociology and reading fancily written theories about the social world, but just comparing that to the kind of honesty of 4-year-olds and their takes on things, I just kind of got hooked. And so that inspired me to do this project, observe for 2 years in a Head Start preschool mainly, and then later in a private preschool, because I wanted to hear more about what kids thought about their experiences.
Yes. And I do love that, like, again, incorporating children's thoughts, because sometimes we forget to do that. Like you said, we get enmeshed with these theories and ideas and concepts around education, and like kind of what best practices is, and you go to professional development and we're learning like, how do I be a better teacher, how do I do this? But not often we're hearing like youth voices, and especially not in early childhood, because we're not really thinking that like their voices are going to add anything, but like they're the ones experiencing it. So,
Mhm.
like it's
Mhm.
important that we're seeing their perspective and that we're hearing their voices because they really do have just unique ways of thinking about things.
Yeah.
And they're just such fascinating little beings. And so I agree. I love, learning from children. And, every time I'm in a classroom, it just makes me think about things in a completely different way, just the way that they experience the world,
Mhm.
because it's all so new. And like the
Mhm.
way that they're experiencing it and the way that they're going about life in it is so fascinating. And it just reminds me to also just
Mhm.
be in the moment sometimes and just, yeah, you know what, you're right, that is a beautiful rock, let's take 5 minutes to look at it and just
Yeah.
feel it and talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's those little things to us that in my everyday life I really don't stop to look at, these small, like a little pebble. I don't stop to look at a tree in that special way, but like kids do, and they're like, whoa, look at it, and I'm
Mm.
like, oh yeah, you're right, that is cool.
Mm.
So their
Yeah.
voices are important and their voices do matter. um,
Mhm.
and so, with your book, False Starts, it talks about segregation in preschool, and it takes place in Madison, Wisconsin. And so, I know you talk about it a little bit in the book too, but why Madison, Wisconsin, and what was your, ideas for studying these particular preschools?
Mhm. So actually, the book didn't start out as being about
Okay.
segregation. When I began the research, I wanted to tell the story of children of color who were from poor families who were at
Mm-hmm.
preschool. And my advisors, because I was also completing my
Mm-hmm.
PhD, my advisors were like, "Oh, you should do a comparative study, compare it to something." And I was like, "But why? Like, can we just let these kids
Mm-hmm.
and their experiences stand alone?" Um, and then towards the end of the observations, so I spent 2 years observing in this Head Start preschool in Madison, and I was just like, what is it? There might be or um, aspects of Head Start or aspects of like structural inequality that matter for what these kids can experience, but I just can't really see it because I'm only in one place. And then I went to the private preschool, which I call Great Beginnings, thinking, um, okay, it's going to be pretty similar. Like they're both rated as high
Mm-hmm.
quality. They both say they're play based. They have experienced
Mm-hmm.
teachers. And I was actually very shocked at how different like many things about daily life were in the preschool. So then the book became about
Mm-hmm.
segregation. Um, and so thinking about Madison, Wisconsin, it's actually not, it's like surprising and not surprising that these things happen
Mm-hmm.
there. So uh, Madison has its own like city funded preschool access program. They call it 4-year-old kindergarten. And that allows parents to get some hours of free preschool in community-based centers or in the public schools. So they have that going. They also have a city-based subsidy for
Mm-hmm.
childcare that like layers on top of the state's subsidy for childcare. And so those things should be improving access to preschool. Like the should be improving
Mm-hmm.
poor families' ability to access
Mm-hmm.
preschool. And then the other layer, anyone who knows Madison, it's a pretty progressive city. Like it kind of has a strong progressive activist base. Sometimes it's kind of out of sync with other parts of the state of Wisconsin. So when you think of all of those
Yeah.
things, it's surprising to kind of point to Madison's segregation, like its residential segregation throughout
Mm-hmm.
the city. And then when you think about preschool, it's kind of disappointing, I
Mm-hmm.
guess. And talking to some folks in Madison who've now read the book, they're like, okay, like I guess it's comforting that we're not so out of sync with the rest of the country. But on the other hand, here we are making these investments,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make preschool really good, and we have these two 5-star high quality programs, and yet things are really different. So it's kind of a non-answer, but I don't think of Madison as like that distinct, like more extreme in its
Mm-hmm.
segregation, or yeah, like an outlier. Basically, it's kind of typical in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. And, when you do look at the data, you have data in the book, but you also look at, if you look at national data too, like the story is similar. Like pretty much what you're saying is that, you could
Mm-hmm.
go to
Yeah.
California, I'm in Southern California, and it's even really segregated
Mm-hmm.
here. And so, from my
Yeah.
experience, I've worked in state funded preschools and
Yeah.
I've worked in privately funded preschools. I haven't worked in a Head Start yet. So that's, one area, one aspect of education that I don't have the most experience in. But state funded and federal funded, they have similarities in some ways. um, But yeah, those experiences are very different. And so, you can even tell like just the diversity in, students in those, state funded, because usually for lower income and across, the United States, the data is fairly similar, right? Low income families tend to be
Yes.
of color. And, you see in the privately funded preschools, it's usually upper middle class, to, more very wealthy families that can afford to have privatized preschool. And the experiences are
Mm-hmm.
just very, very different. And so,
Mm-hmm.
part of the reason that I was really enjoying reading the book, because it mirrored those experiences that I saw and I know that educators are experiencing. And it's a world that like not everyone gets to see both sides of, right? So if
Yeah.
you're a parent,
Yeah.
you often don't get to see both sides of, state funded and privately funded. You usually get to see one of those. And like if you're a student, you usually get to see one of
Mm-hmm.
those. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty fascinating to see what those differences are. And
Mm-hmm.
you know Another thing that I did really appreciate about the book too was that you go into the history of childcare, like in the United States. And throughout all of my classes, I've learned a lot about theory. I've learned a lot about practice. I've learned a lot about, even social justice theory and all these different things. But there was so much I didn't know about the inception of childcare and early childhood
Mm-hmm.
in the United States. And so that was super fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
Yeah, I kind of went on a fact-finding mission
mhm,
about like, am I was like, let me not differentiate by
mm,
type. So at first, I was like, should I only look at things that call themselves preschool?
mm,
Going back in time in the U.S., what did the earliest preschools look like? But you actually can't do that because there's such a um, fraught
mm,
landscape about what group care is. So I just looked for any example of group learning and
mhm,
care. Like, when do people get groups of kids together that were under age 6, to care for them, to educate them, or
mm,
both? And yeah, it turns out it's been segregated by social class and by race
mm.
since the 1830s, pretty much,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
And that is wild. And then knowing, of course, we know that, it's been a predominantly, female dominated field for so long. And then,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like that is why, we see some of like the kind of pay disparities today. And that's why we see, some of the perceptions about, early childhood and early care and preschool teaching that we see today. And it's, because of the
Mm-hmm.
history of it. But there's so much that I didn't know about and I learned about from just reading like, that chapter of the book where it talks about, how did we get here? And I love that. As just like a learning nerd, I was like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Was there anything that, as you were writing it and doing your research that was like really new to you, or anything that was super fascinating as you were kind of writing that section?
Yeah, there's a book called The Transatlantic Kindergarten that's about the foundation of
Mm,
kindergartens, which a lot of educators know. Like, that concept comes from Frederick Froebel in
mm,
Germany. But learning about the women who taught kindergarten in
mm,
Germany, and then the women in the U.S. who wanted to learn this pedagogy and be kindergarten
mm,
teachers, it was actually like a kind of womanist, maybe modern day
mm,
feminist movement, of women who valued early childhood
mm.
education and wanted to teach in this really specific way. And yeah, that book blew my mind.
Wow.
Learning that aspect of it, like thinking of kindergartens not as something, I mean, they are something offered to children, but like that had this deep
Mm,
meaning for the teachers that learned about it. Um, but then it's kind of a depressing story because, as many of us
mm,
know, then kindergarten got like kind of sucked up into the public school
mm,
system and kind of became a lot of what the opposite of what these kindergarten activists, they were called
mm.
kindergarteners. The teachers were called kindergartners, like what they didn't want it to
Yeah.
be, which is sitting in a desk, like more sitting in a
Hmm.
desk, more organized instruction, and less of this like child-led, play-based approach. So
That is so fascinating.
it's kind of random. You might want to cut that. I don't know if you want to
No, I
keep
want to
that in
keep it in there.
there.
Like now I want to check out this book. Like I want to know more about like
Mm-hmm.
just of course like the inceptions of it, because I love education. I love early childhood. And part of advocacy is just wanting it to be the best version of, whatever it is that it can
Mm-hmm.
be. And I think when we know where something came from and we know, where the issues are and kind of like the very inception of it, like that helps us to then kind of redirect and say like, okay, where are we now? Where do we want to be? What was our intention for us to be here,
Yeah.
right? And so these are really just great questions for us
Yeah.
to start asking.
Mm-hmm. And I do think there's lessons for early childhood folks in that
Mm-hmm.
story of kindergarten, of women learning this
Mm-hmm.
pedagogy, understanding early childhood development, designing this experience, this kindergarten experience, and then for better and for worse, it getting kind of co-opted or integrated into an existing K-12
Mm-hmm.
system. Like, one of the things that happened with that transition is you went from these small women-run
Mm-hmm.
kindergartens to K-12 schools, which even at that time, the principals were mostly men who didn't
Yeah.
necessarily have the same values in early childhood. Anyway, so I think about that a lot with places where we're expanding 4K and
Mm-hmm.
4-year-old kindergarten. And there's this impulse to be like, let's just bring 4-year-olds into elementary
Yeah.
schools, and oh, let's bring 3-year-olds in too and do 3K. And um, you kind of brush past all of these community-based preschools,
Mm-hmm.
providers. A lot of them are women. They're women-owned businesses. They know a lot about early childhood, and it kind of delegitimizes those folks and adds legitimacy to the 4K teachers,
Yes.
and also creates these wage gaps where you can make more
Yeah.
money doing similar work, right? If you're doing it at the elementary
Mm-hmm.
school versus down the street in a community-based program.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes. That's, I know there's states, popping up kind of the last couple of years, even before 2020, of, here in California, we're calling it, universal transitional kindergarten, which is pretty much exactly what you're
Mm-hmm.
mentioning, is expanding
Mm-hmm.
transitional kindergarten. So kindergarten generally starts about age 5. And so before it was, you had to turn 5, at least between September and December in order to qualify, or to, yeah, to turn 5 in order to qualify for transitional kindergarten. And then before that, you didn't qualify for it. So, parents either had to do state funded or they had to do private funded until they can go qualify for kindergarten. So transitional kindergarten was kind of this like in between area, but it was only for a certain select, group of kids who could qualify for it. And so now they've
Mm-hmm.
expanded that. So all 4-year-olds can go to transitional kindergarten. And so now we're kind of seeing that it's been co opted, is exactly what you're saying. It's being co opted into this K through 12 space. And we're seeing a lot of hiccups with that because, like, as you're saying, there's these pay gap disparities. And so, with California, you have to have a multi subject teaching credential in order to qualify to teach TK, even though you have early childhood educators who oftentimes, for the most part, actually have degrees in early childhood education, even have advanced degrees in early childhood education, and have been doing this job for multiple years, who suddenly aren't qualified to teach a group of kids that they have been teaching and been teaching very well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's
Mm-hmm.
also a lot of concerns from family childcare and family daycare owners because, again, that's, you're taking out a large subsect of their business and taking it into transitional kindergarten. And then there's also those other, like, the
Mm-hmm.
main concern is this developmentally appropriate? Because if we're doing transitional kindergarten and
Mm-hmm.
we're basically just treating it as kindergarten, but they're 4,
Yeah.
and then they're wanting to expand it to all 3-year-olds, and
Right.
like we're getting younger and younger and younger, but is it actually
Yep.
developmentally
Yep.
appropriate what we're doing? And so there's been a lot of hiccups with like the rollout. I know in California, it's just, that's what I'm kind of seeing and that's what I'm experiencing, but I know other states are trying to roll this out. And so it's fascinating, and it's something that, I know that we are currently advocating for. So I'm part of the local planning council, and so we are trying to do our best to advocate for those family child care owners. We're trying to do our best to advocate for, privately owned centers, and also for those students to make sure that they're getting still high quality care and that it's developmentally appropriate for where they are in life, that they're not sitting at desks all day, that they're still getting time to play, because that's what we know, like their learning comes through their play. Again, I
Mm-hmm.
need to step down off my soapbox now. I just got all passionate about it. So redirecting back to the wonderfulness of this book. So, you looked at 2 different preschools. You looked at, the Great Beginnings, which was the privately funded preschool, And then you looked at a Head Start in the area as well. And so, you went through your experiences both on how the teachers treated you and how the teachers interacted with the students, but also, went over this really great kind of nuance with Head Starts in that, it's geared towards low income families. And so there are, really great benefits that you get with that in terms of services and sort of, more screenings and support in some ways. But also that means, families are hyper surveillanced. So can you talk a little bit about just, these differences between how these families were treated in each program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so Head Start's interesting to me to think about because my sociological take on this is basically what kind of group life and social
Mm-hmm.
setting are these
Yes.
classrooms, and is preschool for families, like how do families experience
Mm-hmm.
preschool as a social space, or as like, if you want to be poetic about it, which I like to be, as if you think of the village it takes to raise a child, right? And you've got the family and they take their kid to Head Start every
Mm-hmm.
day. Head Start's kind of in their village. What is it like for
Yeah.
them? And on the family side, what I observed is that there's some unintended consequences of
Mm-hmm.
policies that are like seem to have the intent of inclusion or
Mm-hmm.
fairness and even family engagement, but that just because we can say, oh, this is why we're setting up a home
Mm-hmm.
visiting policy, or this is why we don't want to celebrate holidays at
Mm-hmm.
school, like it doesn't mean that intention will match on to how families experience
Yes.
it. Yeah. And so I don't know. I could talk about holidays or the home visits. I don't know if any of those pique your interest more.
I mean, they technically both pique my interest more, but I think it, like I said, I've done both. So like I did home visits as a
Uh-huh.
private preschool teacher, and you know
Oh.
that was, it was like, let's get to know your students, you get to know me, I'm in your home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I see the
Mm-hmm.
benefit of that when I was working in that setting. And then kind of the more that I'm
Mm-hmm.
learning more about culturally relevant practices and the more I'm learning about it, I haven't done home visits within the state funded preschool world, and I don't know if that was something. I don't think that was a practice that we did in that school that I worked with, but I can
Mm-hmm.
see that being something that can be a little off putting for a family of like, well, why are you coming
Mm-hmm.
here? Just being really skeptical of
Mm-hmm.
that. And so just,
Mm-hmm.
when I was in the private preschool, it was very welcoming, like, yeah, come on over, come to our house, come see his bedroom, come
Mm-hmm.
see the toys. But I can also see that being something of like,
Mm-hmm.
why are you doing this? Like, are you going to report us? Like, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to talk a little bit
Mm-hmm.
about that experience, like that's something that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't experience. And so I'm wondering like, what is the implication with that too?
Yeah. Yeah. So home visits are one example. Head Start families are supposed to experience 2 home visits per
Mm-hmm.
year. The intention of the home visit is to increase communication and closeness between the family, the child, and the school. And it can really have that
Mm-hmm.
effect, right? That like your teacher comes to your
Mm-hmm.
house, you can show her your toys. You just kind of learn things about each other when you share
Mm-hmm.
space. And, think about it for uh, with preschool, like the families are coming every day into that
Mm-hmm.
setting, but teachers never see families'
Yeah.
homes. So it's just supposed to be like a family engagement practice. Um, but you got to place it for me in the context of how families experience
Mm-hmm.
privacy and surveillance. And this differs a lot by
Yeah.
race and by social class. So there was variety at Head Start. Like I don't want to say at all that
Mm-hmm.
the families all hated the home visits or were like felt like they were being
Mm-hmm.
judged. But I think it's telling that, um, at least at the school that I observed with the home visit practice, they wanted the first one to be at the family's
Mm-hmm.
house, and then the second one the families could choose if they wanted to have it at the preschool, at a park, at McDonald's, or at their house.
Okay.
And the school social worker said that most families chose somewhere else for the second home visit.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and so it makes me think a little bit about choice and
Yeah.
surveillance. And we know from other research and some of us from personal experience that when you're a family in poverty, there's lots of people kind of coming at
Mm-hmm.
you with
Yes.
scrutiny, seeing your life as risky,
Mm-hmm.
worrying if your children are neglected,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's just the kind of fear or possibility of child protective services being involved in your life is much closer to home for poor families and for Black
Yes.
families and Hispanic families and Indigenous families,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that kind of just comes up for some people when uh an authority figure comes to visit your house. And if you're affluent and white, you might not be in that, you might not have a family history of CPS, or like really have that on your mind, that maybe the teacher will see something that they find to be lacking and judge you for it. Um, yeah. And so when I went to Great Beginnings, I was like, so what do you guys do here? When might a teacher come into a family's home? And as a private school, they didn't choose to do home visits. And so that meant that the only time a teacher would come to your house if you were a Great Beginnings kid is if your parents hired a teacher, usually, to come babysit you, right? So it's like a chosen and invited thing. It's all on your terms, versus a like, hey, this is something you agree at Head Start. It's you agreed to do these home visits as part of being in the program. Yeah, so that's one example. And the other one of kind of unintended policy implications was holidays. So Head Start had adopted this policy. I'm not actually sure if it's a federal, like in the federal program, or just this Head Start that I was in Madison, but they didn't want the classroom to celebrate holidays unless they got parent permission. So they said, and the point of this is basically pluralism, right? That you don't want to make some people feel unwelcome. You don't want to privilege religiously overtoned or even secular holidays that not everyone does. So they said, you can do holidays, but we want you to ask every single parent first. And if everyone says it's okay, then you can do it. And the Head Start teachers were like, we're drowning in paperwork over here. Like, we track all these interventions, we track the meal count, we track development, we do gold notes, like, and so the idea for them of doing another layer of paperwork, basically to have fun, it just wasn't appealing. And in the book, I talk about one of the moms. Her pseudonym is Brianna, who had sent her kids to Head Start for 10 years. She had 3 kids, and the policy had changed while she had been there. And so she has 3 kids, and her youngest kid, Sean, is in Head Start. And there's this kind of moment where she is in the classroom and she's like, what happened to Mother's Day presents? And they're like, what do you mean? And she's like, I like, you guys usually make something for Mother's Day. And the teachers are like, oh, well, we changed they changed the policy and we can't celebrate holidays, especially things like Christmas. And Brianna's just like, well, can't you just, like, he's scribbling at daycare, can't you just put Happy Mother's Day on it? I save these, I look forward to them. And the teachers are like, we can ask about it, we'll see. But they're feeling frustrated because it's like, we're here under this paperwork and this isn't really our priority to make crafts for you. Brianna and some of the other parents experience this lack of holidays as like distancing. It could have been, Mother's Day could be something that kind of brings them closer, makes Brianna feel seen by the school, and instead it's like forbidden or you have to do paperwork. And then the contrast that I saw is going to Great Beginnings, where they're private, they make their own rules. And what they decided is, I mean, they didn't do a ton of holidays, but they did acknowledge Halloween and Valentine's Day. And for each of those, they would have parties. The parents would donate, they'd bring supplies, they'd come to the school for the party. Actually, my kid basically goes to a Great Beginnings type of school here in New Hampshire. And they're having a Valentine's party tonight that like is it's going to be very cute. But I just keep thinking like, yeah, here we are having this experience of being able to come together and celebrate, and we're able to do that because it's a school of mostly affluent and white families. So.
I remember,
and not with this this funding mandate that kind of prevents us from doing holidays.
And so when I worked at a state funded preschool, it was kind of the same thing, is that we didn't talk about holidays and we didn't talk about like, I don't think they did Mother's Day and stuff like that, because for that same reason you mentioned, like, they didn't want anyone to feel left out or excluded, so they just kind of didn't talk about it at all. And I can see the logic. I see why. And then I also agree from that paperwork perspective, because when I worked there was a lot more paperwork, like you said, with the meal counts, with the IEPs and with the DRDPs. And like, it was just the teachers were constantly busy doing something. Right. And so, one, it's great to have that data, because that's, with the data, we then go into funding and we can go into resources and all those other things. But at the same time, it's like, and so I know there's a lot of paperwork that goes into, working in state funded preschools. And so it makes it really difficult to really add another thing on top of that. And when I was working in privately funded and we did do holidays, it was a big to do. Like there was a lot, you know, we would have
Mm.
fundraisers, and so we'd have to do like the art show, and so we'd have to like have the kids create art for that and try to still do that in a developmentally appropriate way and still do that in a play-based way, while still also like, okay, I need you to create like 5 pieces of art, like everyone needs to create a bunch of art. So it was just a lot of that. And then during, you know, Mother's Day and Father's Day and stuff like that, it was a lot. Like it's a lot. You have so many students and you have to create so many different things, and again, still trying to do that in a way that is child led. There's a lot that goes into it when you're doing holidays. So I can
Mm-hmm.
kind of see what, you know, the easier way would just be like, we're not going to do it. um but at the same time, like I remember being a student and holidays were really fun, and even if it wasn't a holiday that I celebrated, it was still pretty just like fun to learn about and like have a little break from school. You know, like those are usually just
Mm-hmm.
days when you just didn't do that much like traditional learning, and you just got to like have fun or have a little party or do like a little fun
Yeah.
thing. And so even my students would just love it. It was just a little bit of a break from the day-to-day routine. And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard, like it's hard, especially like as you mentioned in the book, when you're not doing those holidays and there's other rules, like, you know, you can't bring toys into school, and you know, you're not really able to kind of personalize that preschool experience and personalize your school experience. And for a lot of students, you know, they're at the schools for a large portion of their day, and so that is kind of hard when you're not able to personalize that. You're not able to bring in
Mm-hmm.
something that's exciting to you or something that you want to talk about. And it's
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of hard because then you just kind of, as a teacher, you just kind of, you have to skirt past it because you can't talk
Mm-hmm.
about it. Or when I worked at, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a Jewish preschool, you know, the kids would come in, they'd be like, for Christmas I'm gonna do this, and I'm just like, you know, like, um so anyways, um and so it's hard because they're excited and they want to talk about it. They want to bring in, you know, their personal experiences. And, you know, as adults, that's something that we do to connect with each other. We bring our personal experiences and we talk about those, and it offers a way for us to connect. And, you know, when I do a training, I do this, you know, kind of talking about different identities. And so we have our personal identities and you have your social identities. And, you know, your personal identities are things like your name or your place in the family or your interests and your talents, right? Like those are things that make you an individual, right? But then your social identities, so that might be the religion or your culture or your background, or your language, like those are things that give you a sense of belonging. And so both of
Mm-hmm.
those parts of your identity are really important, and especially the way that we connect with ourselves and other people, like they're very, very important. And so it is a kind of a big question on when we do ban talking about, you know, holidays or talking about, you know, cultures or talking about just things like that, like what is that kind of saying on that larger scale, and what are students actually learning
Mm-hmm.
about themselves and each other
Mm-hmm.
when we aren't talking about those things, and when these things are kind of like
Mm-hmm.
off to the sidelines. It's I can, yeah, I can go on
Mm-hmm.
that for like days because I'm just like, I'm curious about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that one, you would wonder like, what's the
Yeah.
answer? Because I actually wouldn't say either. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say let's have these kind of consumery Valentine's Day parties
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. Nor would I probably actually say ban
Yeah.
it. I just think about the way that the Head Start. So the lead teacher at Head Start liked holidays a lot. She's like, I'd love to
Mm-hmm.
celebrate Halloween, and they could in the past, but now they
Mm-hmm.
couldn't. So she had like, she would wear an orange shirt, and she'd be like, we're gonna dissect
Yeah.
pumpkins because that's okay, because that's science, as long as we don't carve faces in them and make them
Mm-hmm.
jack-o'-lanterns. So anyway, it could have been something she could take creative license with, and she could find a, she like maybe could have done the paperwork to ask
Mm-hmm.
families if they felt okay
Yeah.
with it. But for her, that this one thing, this Mother's Day card moment, was like
Mm-hmm.
in a broader context of her being slammed with
Yeah.
paperwork. And the paperwork thing, another reader put this in really stark terms for me. Like, I don't even say it this starkly in the
Mm-hmm.
book, but we were talking about communication with parents and how, like, Head Start tried to send newsletters but didn't really get around to
Mm-hmm.
it. They didn't send a lot of photos. This kind of made some of the parents
Mm-hmm.
sad, but they had to do all this paperwork for the
Yep.
state. And so then I go to Great Beginnings and I'm like, what paperwork do you do? And I see that they send um, monthly newsletters like
Mm-hmm.
clockwork. They send a weekly email with here's everything we did, here's pictures of your individual
Yep.
children. They would write down who napped at nap time, which was not required by like
Mm-hmm.
licensing, like heavy communication. And so at Great Beginnings, I was like, how do you feel about this paperwork though? Like, come on, this seems kind of annoying to write all these newsletters. And they're like, no, we love it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like creative and it's fine. Anyway, and what a reader said to me was like, oh yes, this makes sense because both schools are just communicating with their funders. Head Start's communicating to the state who's funding it, and the private preschool's communicating to the parents because the parents are funding the preschool.
Yeah.
I was like, I mean, yikes, yeah.
Basically, yeah, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
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 No, that is super fascinating because again, I in my private preschool, world, I did a lot of that. I did a lot of newsletters and, we used this app where you could communicate with, the parents, and I would always like, every day I would write these like paragraphs to the parents and just like, okay, this is what we said at circle time. This is the activities we did and this is how it connects to the preschool foundations. And so it's not like I didn't have a lot of like mandatory paperwork that I was doing within the private preschool, but I did still do a lot of like paperwork and a lot of things and a lot of
Yeah.
documentation.
Yeah.
And we still did parent teacher
Yeah.
conferences. And so we still did a lot of things and like lesson planning and stuff, but it wasn't required. So the stress of it was less because it was just something I was doing
Mm-hmm.
because I kind of wanted to do it. It wasn't required of me. Like, my director
Mm-hmm.
never said, I need you to write newsletters. I need you to do this. It was just, oh yeah, like parents are curious about what we're doing and they're asking me questions, so
Mm-hmm.
let me tell you what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than, in
Mm-hmm.
that state funded free school, it was mandatory. So again, in order for them to have funding, they have to do these different things, and it does take up. And because it's mandatory and because it's more like government forms and government paperwork, like it's not fun. Like doing
Mm-hmm.
DRDPs
Mm-hmm.
isn't fun,
And it can also undermine trust
Yes.
and make the teachers feel not trusted and not
Yes.
supported. So the lead teacher at Head Start, Miss Roxanne, she had her bachelor's, she had 8 years of
Mm-hmm.
experience. She knew her stuff. And her perspective was like, I know what's developmentally
Mm-hmm.
appropriate. I know how to engage with the kids. And I would say she was totally right. Like she was great with them. But she's like, but I spent half my time doing
Yeah.
paperwork about what I'm going to do with the kids
Mm-hmm.
and then what I did do with the kids. And I was there to see when she
Yeah.
left, things were a little different. The assistant teachers didn't engage the kids in the same
Mm-hmm.
way. Like they did a great job, but they did it a little
Yeah.
differently. So from a policy perspective, it's just kind of ironic that like we layer on this paperwork to feel like we're getting our money's worth
Mm-hmm.
out of some intervention that's been funded, but it can have the consequence. I mean, one, it layers. That's
Mm-hmm.
the other thing. Each individual program is like, let's do a dental hygiene intervention. Let's do a nutrition program. Let's do some
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness. And each one of them just wants like one form a week on how you
Yeah.
implement it. But now this teacher has 3 additional forms she has to fill
Yeah.
out, you know?
Yeah.
And so she left that the Head Start preschool. And the paperwork wasn't the only reason, but it was a
Mm-hmm.
factor. And she went to a preschool with um children who weren't in poverty and with a director that didn't, I mean, not, it wasn't state
Mm-hmm.
funded. And then she said she had a director that trusted her,
Yes.
would come and observe from time to time and be like, oh great, you know what you're
Mm-hmm.
doing, like I don't need to see the lesson plans, I see that you
Yes.
you know respond to kids'
Mm-hmm.
interests and know how to engage. And that like trust in her skill and her work meant so much to her
Yes.
as a teacher. So it bums me out that like she's so talented
Mm-hmm.
and the Head Start kids kind of lost her experience
Yeah.
because she went somewhere with less paperwork where she was
Yeah.
trusted. Yeah.
And that happens, surprisingly often, right? And so for as expensive
Mm-hmm.
as, preschool is and childcare is in general, preschool teachers don't generally get paid that much,
Yeah.
Um,
No matter where
no
they
matter where
work,
you work,
really.
like you just
Like,
don't get paid
yeah.
very much,
Yeah.
whether you're in, private or publicly
Mm-hmm.
funded. But I will say that Head Start has been
Mm-hmm.
actively trying to, increase funding so that they can pay teachers more. And when I worked, the
Mm-hmm.
highest wage I ever made was working with a state funded preschool. And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
on the bright side, you have that. But then on the other side, it's I didn't see the same caliber of teachers. So, both, forms like even, in the state funded and the privately funded, you had educators who were very educated and you had educators who'd been in the field for years, right? But then it's just kind of different in the caliber of teachers that you're getting because the teachers that I worked with in private preschools were so creative. They came up with these like crazy
Mm-hmm.
ideas. Like every week we'd come in and they're like, okay, so I went over here and I got a stick or I got these sticks from the beach and we're going to paint them and we're going to do like so creative, so many ideas and just
this just like flavor for life was happening. But then I walk into these state funded preschools, and so in that environment, I wasn't a teacher per se, but I was kind of a coordinator. So I would go to different classrooms, and so I'd see like different, how teachers were working in these different classrooms. But because it's so strict on what you can do, even the materials that you are in the classroom, you can't really bring in extra materials. Like, you have to work with what you have. And so in a lot of different ways, it kind of dulls down what the teachers can do, and it dulls down how creative you can be. You can only be so creative when you only think inside of a box, right? And so, like, I still saw teachers, doing the best that they could with what they had. But again, they're still really, really confined. And again, there's all that paperwork and additional things that you have to do. So even if you do plan a really great lesson, you're probably not the one who's really able to reap the benefits of seeing the kids enjoy that activity, because you're, okay, I got to prep for this, I got to plan for this, I got to make sure I write down all of these different things. And so you're not getting that same kind of one-on-one interaction with the students as they're engaging with this thing that you work so hard for them to be able to do. And it's such a fascinating difference to really see. And again, it's great to see it in a book, because I'm like, I've seen these things. I've seen both of these things happen in real time. And it's just fascinating to know that this is, not a unique experience. Like, this is happening in other places too, and other people are getting to see this. And it's interesting to say the least.
Yeah.
And so in terms of, looking at policies and looking at, what schools and what teachers and center directors can do, what kind of policies or practices do you think they can put into place that can either kind of invite or discourage students from their different social classes to kind of bring their full selves to school?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is that integration matters. I always think there's a role for culturally affirming preschools for kids of color. I think that's great. Like, if it's kind of on purpose, and you're like, I have a program where we speak all in Spanish, and the families are all Mexican, and we can share our culture here. And I think that's great. There's some preschools that are like for Black children, and they're really pro-Black, and like great representations of all the awesome things about being Black. Like, I would love to send my kids to a preschool like that. And I think they can do real good. There's empirical evidence that they can be really beneficial for children. So that's great. But accidental racial segregation, where we just like, it wasn't on purpose, it wasn't for the goal of like affirming the identities of kids of color. And then class segregation, for me, there's no role for that. There's no actual reason for it. The Head Start's reason for class segregation, right? Because Head Start programs, 90% of the kids are supposed to be in poverty in most Head Start centers. The reason to do that is because it's efficient. Because we want to bring these services to kids in poverty. We want to give whole child supports and whole family supports, and it costs money to do that. So I think the logic is like, well, let's put 17 poor kids in a class, and then we can bring all of these supports to the one room. And my research suggests that there's many unintended social consequences of like clustering kids in that way. And I think it's convenient for these programs that have all affluent children. Like, I don't think there's a good reason to have programs where all the children are middle class. So sorry, to your question, like the intersections of race and class in early childhood education, I think there is an extremely like important benefit to working to create more integrated programs. And I think social class is actually the easier way to start, because that will help with providing some access to poor families of color as well. But because many preschools in the US are privately funded and privately operated, like the cost and subsidy issue, like that is going to be a barrier. And so preschools have to meaningfully think about, especially the private programs, how am I making this program inviting and accessible to poor families? And there's different categories, right? There's poor families that might qualify for a subsidy. So then you're dealing with like, and I know it's not easy, but you're dealing with all the issues of preparing to accept the subsidy, doing all that paperwork. And then there's also this role, I think we don't talk about enough, of middle income families. Like not affluent families, but families that do not qualify for subsidies, and they also cannot pay $1,500 a month in tuition, right? Yeah, I think it's like in a sneaky way making the class segregation we do see in preschool much more extreme, so that the families in my field site at Great Beginnings, like, they weren't middle class, they were upper middle class or affluent, like taking vacations to Disney World, second homes, you know? So anyway, if you're a center director, like, think about, is my program inviting and accessible to low income students and to middle income students? Yeah, in Great Beginnings, they were like, yeah, we accept the childcare subsidies, but we don't have any families that use them, and we had one, but they didn't stay very long. And for me, being there and observing, over the course of the month, I'm like, I kind of get that, because the vibe in the school was like catered to families with money. They have things like parents' night out, where you bring your kids on a Saturday and you pay, I don't know how much, maybe 20 or 30 bucks, so you can go on a date night, right? Which is just a super like classed experience. Like, the idea that someone has $30 for date night and they have somewhere to go, just to go spend money or be on a date, right? Having fundraisers, having donation drives, can kind of send a message that, like, of course everyone here has extra to give and is not actually in need. So just kind of thinking, like, what might your school be communicating about who it's for? And if you've dealt with a financial access piece, how can you make it socially inviting to people who don't have a lot of extra money, basically? Yeah.
Yes, I think that is such a great point, because obviously the subsidies are great, and one of the beautiful things that I think about when I think about early childhood is that there are so many different philosophies. So if you want to do, fully play based, or you want to do Montessori, or you want to do Reggio, or you want to do, whatever it is, like, there are so many options, right? But that's only for a certain subset of families who can afford to have that, right? That idea of voice and choice, right? You have to have money to have voice and choice, basically. And if you don't, then you get Head Start, you get nothing, right? Or you can get subsidies to go to either, family childcare, or you can go, to a private funded, school that accepts subsidies. And again, there's so much that goes into accepting those subsidies, and there's so much paperwork, and it's often have a lot of work for like very little benefit to the actual, childcare, owner or provider, right? And so you don't see a lot of them utilizing it, because it's frankly a pain in the butt. So, that also, decreases access. And so, but there's also that idea of like, okay, so now you have a low income child in your, in your center. Great. Now what? How do we make it inviting? Exactly what you're saying. How do we make sure that the families feel like they're welcome there, that they feel like they belong there? How do we make sure that the child feels like they're welcome there and that they belong there, right? So if you accept one subsidized, childcare thing, and everyone else in your classroom is, white, upper class, or affluent children, and then you have this one poor Black child, you can't just like, okay, welcome to the class, have fun. There are things that you have to put in place to make sure that everyone's feeling welcome, that they belong, right? Because then you're not going to see people utilizing that because they don't feel like they belong there. And that's looking at, our teachers in the classroom. There's going to be some additional training that you're going to need to do in order to make sure that you are incorporating practices in that classroom that are culturally relevant, culturally sustaining, culturally responsive, that you're incorporating, books in your classroom, and resources in your classroom, and toys in your classroom, right? And that you're talking to these families. Like, there's so much that goes into it. So you can't just like do it and then walk away and be like, okay, I did a good deed. Like, I have low income students in my classroom now. Wonderful. It's like, well, no. Like, you can't just have one of them and say you've met your quota. Like, that's weird and wrong. So there's just things that need to go into place in order for that to be actually effective, and it actually have the benefits that we know that it can, because we know that when schools are fully inclusive, the benefit to all of the students and all the families is so immense, right? We know there's a lot of learning, a lot of really great opportunities and beautiful things that happen when we have fully inclusive environments and fully inclusive schools. And so, like you're saying, that's looking at socially, that's looking at, class, that's looking at race, that's also looking at, special needs, that's looking at ability, right? So when we have schools that are fully inclusive, it's a beautiful, amazing experience. But it does take work to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it adds like kind of why I think integration would be so helpful is it adds a challenge for teachers to just rethink some of the like routines and the practices in the classroom, that you could do that. You could sit there and try to, you know, rethink or modify practices, even if you teach in an all white, all affluent school. But by having like an actually integrated group of kids, the challenges are more real, basically, and you go into like problem solving mode. You might get new ideas from the families and the kids in your school. So yeah, I'm not a teacher, not cut out to be a preschool teacher. I'm not going to claim to have the answers there. But yeah, I will just like advocate for center directors in particular, like working on this challenge of being open and available to a broader range of families, because I do think that matters. I think there's this thing in ECE, probably because of quality rating and improvement systems, right? And some of these checklists that want you to have culturally diverse books and like diverse food in the house area, which does matter. Like, I'm not saying take that stuff out, but it leads to this, okay, we have the colors of us, we have sushi in the play area, like check. And from Head Start did those same things. From what I observed, like that is not a substitute for real, challenging, messy conversations that you have directly with children and with families about like the real people, basically. Like we can't put in these abstract things as materials and books and just have them available in the classroom and think that that is sufficient to like make the space inclusive.
Exactly. Like that is, again, I couldn't agree with you more. Like seeing the attempts to have more diversity in the classroom, great. We want to see that. I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, stop doing that. No, please keep doing that. It's more of a yes and. So yes, do increase the visibility of diversity in the classroom. Yes. And also, let's make sure, like you're saying, we're having these conversations, that we're engaging authentically, that we're looking at our policies to make sure that we're not unintentionally alienating a certain group within our classroom, right? And so that's really going to take a lot of internal work, a lot of asking ourselves some questions about, you know, what beliefs do we have going into this? What ideas do we have? What stereotypes might we be inadvertently leaning into? And that's hard and that's messy work. And it involves, you know, building a community that works with our families and really takes in all of their input. And so I'm not going to sit here and say this is an easy thing that you can just do this overnight and that, you know, you can like wave a magic wand and, oh, cool, I have now done diversity. So what's next? It's like, no, it's ongoing work. It's hard work, but it's important work, right? And that is improving that access, improving that integration into our schools. That is, again, it is such a beautiful thing when we have fully inclusive and fully diverse schools. I've seen it, I've been there. It is a beautiful experience, and seeing all of these students getting to play together with their differing abilities and having these conversations and incorporating those conversations and having them think about things in a very different way is such a beautiful and amazing experience that we don't see when we have schools that are fully segregated. And on that topic, you know, you kind of mentioned a little bit about having school integration, but how do you reimagine education moving forward? What does the future of education look like?
I'm going to answer this for early childhood, and because I think that's right, a missing piece. I think it's a missing piece. I try to see it as opportunity. Because when I talk about this, people are like, oh, but segregation, like look at K-12 segregation. Look at the deeply entrenched segregation we have in K-12. Folks have been trying to undo and fix that for decades, right? So then for me to come here and say, oh, you should also care about preschool segregation as well, can feel impossible. But to me, it's actually very hopeful because we're in an expansion phase. Like we don't have preschool available to all children. There's not one city where like all the 4-year-olds attend preschool, right? Many places are working on opening programs, adding funding, expanding the system. And so I think it's a great opportunity point to ask ourselves, what do we want this to look like? And to ask these deeper questions of like, what does it mean for a classroom, a preschool classroom, to support children's dignity? What do children need to find these classrooms to be exciting, enriching, and affirming? And I think like there's some merits to them, but I don't think we have that captured in class or in the environmental rating scale or all these things we use to then assign stars and colors to like preschool. So I don't think that our quality metrics are the answer here. I think we can still ask deeper questions, and educators and like center directors can, just continue to touch base with like what their vision is for fully educating children.
Yes.
And then I think that we need to consider race and class integration as part of that.
Yes.
Early childhood is not like some weird post-racial utopia where kids won't see color unless we tell them we reveal the fact of racism to them. Like it's completely embedded in all the structural racism that the rest of us are dealing with. So anyway, we need to, like, about 70% of kids go to preschool in the US. That means we have to build many more preschool environments. And I would love to see them support children's dignity, offer class and race integration, like honestly, class integration for everyone. There's no reason, in my opinion, that poor children should be clustered in schools. They should have access to the full range of schools. And then I lost my train of thought. There was one more thing I was going to say. Oh, we love a birth to 5 system. So preschool expansions, like, I don't want public schools to be the drivers of envisioning what preschool should look like. I think it's really dangerous, because K-12 principals don't always get early childhood as a special time of life. They don't understand these principles necessarily. A lot of these buildings are not built for 3 and 4-year-old bodies, and they're definitely not built for 2-year-old bodies. And so I want to see like a childcare expansion, not just a preschool expansion. And we have to think about births to 5. Like, seeing this in Colorado was kind of wild. I previously lived there and was kind of in there watching them. They're expanding access to preschool right now. So I don't want to see a system where we have preschool for all or for most, but if your child's 1 or 2, like there's nothing and there's nobody, because all of those providers in those care and education settings have been decimated when funding just gets funneled to age 4. So I want us to think about education starting from birth and enhancing dignity for babies, for toddlers, for preschoolers. And then K-12, there's lots to think about there, but we can do this with early childhood. We can figure this out.
I believe that. And I love that you've switched it into thinking about it as, a place of hope and a place of opportunities, because that's exactly what it is. We can get discouraged by it, but it is a space of hope. Like we have such an opportunity to refine the field and make it inclusive and really change it for how we see early childhood to be. And I know we have, something here, I think it's kind of national, but, the P3 alignment. So it's like prenatal to kind of 3rd grade, really incorporating that, all of that early childhood frame. And we can't forget about our infant and toddlers. Like their education is also important. And infant toddler teachers are teachers. Like they are important, and they provide such a valuable, environment and opportunities for these, young growing minds. And so, yes, incorporating that and really just thinking of early childhood, not just preschool, the whole thing, all of it is such an incredible time of life. And there's so much learning, there's so much growing. We need to focus on it. And we have so many great minds out there that are thinking about this and are proposing really great thoughts. And so I want to thank you so much for joining me and for, releasing this really beautiful book. Again, please read it. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you so much, Brittany.
Yes, thank you. So where can my audience find you? Are you working on anything you want to kind of share before we close out?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So the best place to find me right now is my website, which is just CaseyStockstill.com. And what I'm working on is I did a follow-up study taking the questions that arose when I spent these 2 years observing preschools in Madison. I just wondered, like, what do these patterns look like if I was able to engage with more schools? And so I was fortunate to get about 60 private preschools in Denver to participate in a study where, like, I did a survey of the directors. I interviewed teachers of 4-year-olds at those same centers. And then I'm doing like a content analysis of their websites and how they market themselves to families. So the big questions are basically like, when we divide up these schools and think about the race and the class of the students they serve, you know, what differences might we see in how they engage with families, how they set up teachers' work experiences, and how they organize children's time. So I'm actively analyzing that right now. That's been really fun. And I'm hoping that I'll be writing some stuff about that soon. So my website's the best place to kind of see what's coming out on this project.
Awesome. And I will put that in the description box or the show notes so you can kind of check that out and see what Casey's up to. And then if you want to check out her book, I've added it to my kind of bookshop link. So it'll be right there. So you can click on it. It says, you know, Conscious Friends. So all the book people that I talk to, I'll try to add their books to that. So it'll all kind of be in a nice little contained box. So please go check it out. And thank you so much, Casey, for joining me. It was such a pleasure speaking with you and just being able to fangirl over this book. It's been amazing. And thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brittany. This was really, really fun and enriching.
Yay, thank you so much.
Yay.
Thank you for tuning into Conscious Pathways. Please like, follow, and subscribe to Conscious Pathways wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to share or leave a rating. It really does help the podcast to grow and reach more listeners just like you. If you are interested in checking out Casey's book, False Start, you can click the link in the show notes or the description box. It'll take you to my bookshop.org platform, and you can check out all of the books that's under Conscious Friends. So any books that I have talked about or any authors I've talked to, their books will be linked directly there. By purchasing the book through bookshop.org, you are supporting the podcast, and you're also supporting independent, locally owned bookshops. So it's a really great way if you want to just support beautiful things just like this and like small bookshops. So you can click that link below. Until next time, navigate your conscious journey with courage and kindness. I'll see you then for more transformative conversations in education. Bye!